She had been invisible for 6 years. She mopped the floors they walked on, emptied the bins that held their discarded fortunes, breathed the cold, recycled air of a building that did not know her name. Then, one night, 10 interpreters failed in front of a deal worth $150 million, and a cleaning woman in a gray uniform stepped forward and started speaking Arabic, and the most dangerous man in Chicago discovered that the person he had never seen was the only one who had understood everything. Hi, my name is Emma, and welcome back to Emma Romance Library. If you're new here, I am so glad you found us. And if you've been here before, you already know. We don't do ordinary stories. We do the kind that stay with you after the screen goes dark. Before we begin, I want to ask you something, and I really want you to answer in the comments. Has there ever been a moment in your life when you made yourself smaller, not because you couldn't shine, but because someone else needed the light more? Tell me, drop it in the comments below, and maybe your answer will be read in the next video. Now, let me take you inside a glass tower at 3 a.m, where a woman who gave up everything is about to change everything, starting with 12 minutes and 7 languages. The first thing I noticed when I arrived at the 31st floor was that someone had spilled coffee near the northeast corner of the conference room and tried to clean it themselves. They had done it wrong. A paper towel pressed straight down on a hot liquid stain without blotting, just pushing the tannins deeper into the grout between the marble tiles, creating a ghost ring that my standard solution would need 3 passes to lift. I noticed this the way I noticed most things in the building after 6 years. Precisely, silently, and without being asked. My cart had a slightly loose wheel on the left rear. It had developed a faint percussion over the past 3 weeks, a soft click every 4 rotations that I had learned to anticipate the way you learn to anticipate a hiccup in familiar music. The sound of it accompanied me down the corridor of the 31st floor, as I moved from office to office at 11:47 in the evening, the building nearly empty, the city spread below the windows like a circuit board with too many lights left on. Meridian Capital Group occupied floors 20 through 38. I cleaned floors 20 through 31. I had never been above 32. I knew the layout of every office on my floors the way a person knows the rooms of a house they grew up in, not by memory, but by body. I knew which partners left their windows cracked and which ones kept the air sealed tight. I knew the one analyst who always left a half-eaten protein bar in the top left drawer of his desk, and the one VP who kept a photo of his dog turned face down when he was stressed. I knew which plants were real and which were silk. I knew where the good light fell at 2 a.m. when the city's reflected glow came through the glass at a particular angle and turned the marble floor briefly golden. I knew all of this. None of it had ever mattered to anyone. I was pushing the cart toward the east corridor when I heard it. The particular quality of silence that a meeting room produces when the people inside it are no longer able to pretend that things are going well. I had learned to identify that silence over years of working around closed doors at night. It was different from the silence of an empty room. It had texture. Weight. The faint hum of bodies held rigid. The Meridian Capital Group conference suite on the 31st floor had 3 rooms. The main room, which could seat 24, had floor-to-ceiling glass on the north wall facing the lake. The secondary rooms flanked it. That night, the lights in the main conference room were fully lit, unusual for this hour. Even more unusual, voices. Not loud, but persistent. A cadence I recognized without understanding the words. Arabic. Gulf dialect, I thought automatically, the way my brain parsed language before I even decided to. Egyptian register layered under it. Like someone who had learned Gulf Arabic from formal instruction, but grew up with something older. The speakers were not happy. There was a particular stress pattern in Gulf Arabic that I had studied during my 2nd year at the University of Geneva, a lengthening of certain vowels under emotional pressure, a slight glottal tightening before a word that carries accusation. I was hearing both. I did not slow my cart. I moved past the conference room door, counted the voices. 4 distinct registers on the Arabic side, the cadence of people who expected to be answered and were not being answered. On the other side, English, strained. The particular English of a person who has just been told something they were not prepared to hear and is pretending they were. None of my business. I moved to the east corridor, parked my cart, and began with the office nearest the stairwell. I had completed 2 offices and was working on the 3rd when the door at the end of the corridor opened, and a man I recognized walked out. Carmine Positano, floor supervisor for the executive suite, technically my chain of command's chain of command. In 6 years I had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times. He had spoken to me perhaps 4. I was not someone he thought about. He was thinking about something now. His face had the specific tension of a man carrying a problem he cannot put down. He walked past me without looking at me, stopped, turned back. "You," he said. I looked up from the window I was cleaning. "You're the one on this floor tonight?" Not a question. "Coppola." "Yes." He stared at me for a moment, as if trying to remember whether I was real. "Anyone else up here?" "I haven't seen anyone." He nodded once, the nod of a man who has already made a decision and is just confirming the perimeter of the damage. He started to walk away again, then stopped. "You know they've been up here since 8? 9 interpreters, now 10, all useless." He said it the way people say things to walls. Then he left. I finished the window. I moved my cart 2 feet to the right and began on the next section. The Arabic voices carried faintly down the corridor. More agitated now, I thought. The vowel lengthening more pronounced. One of the 4 voices, the older one, was using a specific phrase that I had not heard in several years. A phrase that did not translate cleanly into English, and that, if you tried to force it into a business context without understanding its social weight, would land as an insult, even though it was technically a compliment. I knew this. Someone in that room did not. I pulled a fresh cloth from my cart. I folded it exactly in thirds, a habit from my first week on the job, a small precision that cost nothing and that I had maintained because small precisions were what I had left. I pressed it against the glass. The older Arabic voice said the phrase again, more slowly this time. The way you repeat something when you cannot understand why the other person is not understanding you. I set down my cloth. I stood in the corridor for 11 seconds. I counted, the way I had always counted, because counting was how I kept myself from acting before I thought. 11 seconds. Then I walked to the conference room door, raised my hand, and knocked. The door was opened by a man I had never seen from this close. I had seen Ciro Savastano from a distance. Everyone on my floors had seen him from a distance. He existed at a remove that most people in the building accepted as natural. The way you accept that there are floors in certain buildings you will never access. He moved through Meridian the way weather moves through a place, with an authority that was atmospheric rather than announced. He had the particular stillness of a person who has learned that motion is a form of disclosure. Up close, he was different in the way that landmarks are always different up close. Less monumental, more specific. The scar along his jaw, the small imprecision in the nose, the cufflinks catching the conference room light, platinum, engraved, the kind of small detail that most people would not notice, but that I noticed the way I noticed the coffee stain on the marble. As information, he looked at me, not at my uniform, not at my cart in the corridor behind me, not at the cloth still in my left hand. At me. With the focused attention of someone who is very rarely surprised and is currently deciding whether to classify this as a surprise or a problem. "You knocked," he said. "Yes. Why?" I looked past him at the room. 4 men seated on the far side of the table. Expensive suits, but not Meridian suits. Different tailoring. A younger man standing near the window, his posture the particular stiffness of someone who has just been publicly humiliated. On the Meridian side, 3 people I recognized by sight, and 1 I didn't, all of them wearing the expression of a meeting that had gone sideways some hours ago and had not recovered. I looked back at Ciro Savastano. "The senior speaker," I said, keeping my voice low, "used a specific idiom from a Hijazi register that your interpreters are hearing as a criticism. It isn't. It's an expression of conditional respect. It means he's still willing to proceed, but only if he believes you understand what he's actually offering. He said it twice. He's about to say it a 3rd time, and after that, he'll stop saying it." A pause that I had time to count. 3 seconds. "And if he stops saying it?" Ciro Savastano asked. The next 12 minutes were the most concentrated use of language I had made since the afternoon 8 years ago, when I sat in a seminar room in Geneva and defended my thesis on lexical interference and multilingual code switching before a panel of 3 professors and received a standing ovation from a room of 20 people who understood exactly. Then he'll stand up, and then the deal will be over. Another pause. 1 second. "You speak Arabic," among others. He stepped back from the door. What I had done. I had not thought about that afternoon in a long time. I did not think about it then either. There was no room for it. I stood at the head of the table in my gray cleaning uniform, the cloth still in my left hand because I had no pocket large enough to put it in and no moment to set it down, and I translated. Not just Arabic to English. I translated register to register. The senior speaker's particular mixture of Gulf formality and Hijazi warmth required not just linguistic precision, but a kind of social geometry. Understanding what was being communicated on the surface, what was being communicated beneath it, and what would be destroyed if the two were conflated. I gave Meridian what the senior speaker meant. I gave the senior speaker what Meridian intended, but had been failing to say. I filled the gap that 10 trained interpreters had not been able to bridge, and I filled it in 12 minutes, and I knew when it was done, because the senior speaker leaned back in his chair, placed both palms flat on the table, a gesture of completion in the Hijazi body language register, the physical equivalent of a signature, and said, in Arabic, something that translated approximately as, "Now we can begin." I translated that too. There was a moment of silence in the room that felt different from the earlier silence. Lighter, with the particular quality of air after pressure releases. The younger man near the window exhaled audibly. One of the 3 people I recognized from the Meridian side looked at me as though I had performed a conjuring trick. The senior Arabic speaker said something to his colleague, brief, and they both glanced at me with a respect that I recognized from academic contexts and had not expected to encounter again. I took a step back. My cart was still in the corridor. I had floors 29 and 30 still to cover before 4:30. Ciro Savastano was watching me from the far end of the table. He had not looked away during the entire 12 minutes. I knew this not because I had been watching him. I had not. I had been working, but because I was a linguist, and a linguist knows where attention is located in a room the way a musician knows where the sound is coming from. His attention had been on me the way a fixed point is fixed, without effort, without question, as though it had simply always been there. I nodded once, the professional nod I had developed over 6 years of being invisible, the nod that communicated completion without requesting acknowledgement, and walked out. My cart was exactly where I had left it. The loose wheel clicked 4 times as I turned it toward the east corridor. I unfolded the cloth I was still holding, refolded it properly in thirds, and placed it back in the cart. Then I went to floor 29 and began cleaning. I told myself in 6 different languages that what had just happened was nothing. Emma, I need a second. Annalisa walked back to her cart and kept cleaning. After 12 minutes, that changed everything. She went back to mopping floors. I think that detail alone tells you more about who she is than any introduction could. By the time I reached floor 29, I had constructed the explanation I would use if asked. The voices carried through a vent. Possible, the old buildings had strange acoustics. I happened to study languages in another life. Verifiable, but vague enough not to invite questions. I was leaving anyway. True, the schedule was the schedule. Nobody asked. The floor was empty when I arrived, and I worked through it with the systematic focus that 6 years of the same job produces. Not robotic, but economical. Every motion had a purpose. Every tool had its correct sequence. There was a kind of grammar to it that I had over time come to appreciate. The way a sentence has a grammar. The way a structured argument has a grammar. You begin with the periphery and work inward. You disturb only what needs to be disturbed. You leave things more ordered than you found them, and you do not leave traces of your presence. Languages, I had learned young, worked the same way. You enter a language the way you enter a room in someone else's house, with attention, with respect for what is already there, with the understanding that the architecture preceded you and will outlast you. Rachel had taught me that. My mother, who had come to Chicago from a town outside Naples with $400 and a working knowledge of 3 words in English, yes, work, and please. Who had added words the way you add tools, one at a time, when you understood what they were for. Who had, by the time I was 7, developed an English that was structurally odd and emotionally precise, a language she had built herself, from the inside out, the way you build a house when you cannot afford an architect. She had been proud of me. I knew that in the way you know things that are never directly stated, in the quality of her silence when I called from Geneva, the particular way she said, "Brava, filia mia," with the faint thickness in her voice that meant she was holding something back. She had been 50 when I was at the university, 52 when the diagnosis came, 54 when I came home. I did not let myself think about this on floor 29. I rarely let myself think about it anywhere. It was too large to carry and still move efficiently, and efficiency was what I had. I was halfway through the west corridor when my phone buzzed. A text from Tiziana, my neighbor, and the closest thing I had to a person who knew me well enough to worry. "You okay? You didn't answer my message from this afternoon." I had not answered. Because there was nothing to say. Tiziana worked the early morning shift at a coffee shop near our building and sent me messages the way some people send lifelines. Not urgently, but steadily, because she understood that I lived at a remove from most things, and she had decided, years ago, to bridge it anyway. Fine, I typed. Long shift. She sent back a coffee cup emoji and then, I saved you the good bread from this morning, it's on your counter. She had a key to my apartment. She used it only to leave food. I put the phone back in my uniform pocket and continued cleaning. The corridor smelled of printer toner and the faint chemical sweetness of the industrial carpet cleaner I'd used on a stain near the stairwell door an hour earlier. At the end of the hall, the window gave onto the lake, black water and the scattered lights of the North Shore. I stood there for 4 seconds, which was the most I allowed myself, and then turned back to the cart. Tiziana had appeared in my life 3 years ago, when she moved into the apartment across the hall, with 2 suitcases and a specific expression I recognized from mirrors, the look of someone who has simplified their life down to what fits. We had become friends the way people become friends when they're both slightly outside the normal current of things, not by seeking it, but by finding ourselves in the same quiet water. She was the only person who knew about Geneva. I had told her one night in October, during a power outage that had lasted 4 hours and forced us both into the hallway with candles, as though the darkness had loosened something. I had told her about the scholarship, about my mother, about the day I made the choice, not dramatically, just as facts, the way you report on something that happened in a country you no longer live in. Tiziana had listened without interrupting, which was the thing I valued most about her. Then she had said, "You gave up your whole life for someone who will one day not remember you gave it. Not cruel, just true." "Yes," I had said. "And would you do it again?" I had thought about it for a real length of time. Then, yes. She had nodded like she already knew. Then she had refilled my candle from hers and said, "Okay, then let's talk about something else." And we had. My mother had not known who I was for the last 14 months of her life. The Alzheimer's had moved quickly, which the doctors said sometimes happened with early onset cases, as though the disease, once it found its way in, had things to do and wasted no time. By the end, she called me by the name of a woman I didn't know, someone from her childhood in Naples, a neighbor or a friend or a cousin, someone she had loved and lost, the way people lose people in the places they leave. She would hold my hand and tell me things about this person in Italian, and I would listen, and I understood everything she said, and I would never tell her I wasn't who she thought I was. I finished floor 29 at 2:47 and moved to 30. I did not think about the conference room. I did not think about the 12 minutes. I did not think about platinum cufflinks with a letter engraved on them that I had not had time to identify, or the quality of attention that had been on me from the far end of a table while I worked. I told myself this in Mandarin, because Mandarin had a grammar of restraint built into its structure that English did not, and sometimes I needed that. I cleaned floor 30. I restocked the supply cart. I completed the incident log. I clocked out at 6:03, 3 minutes late, and walked to the elevator. The elevator opened on the lobby, and I stepped out, and Ciro Savastano was standing at the security desk. He was wearing the same suit. The cufflinks still caught the light. He was holding a leather binder, dark brown, worn at the spine, and talking to the overnight security guard with the ease of someone for whom all spaces are equally inhabited. He glanced toward the elevator as the doors opened. Our eyes met for the second time that night. He said nothing. Neither did I. I walked past him through the lobby, through the revolving door, and out into the 6:15 morning of a Chicago February. Gray sky, lake wind, the smell of the city before it properly starts. I turned left toward the bus stop. I had gone half a block when I heard my name. Not hey or excuse me, or the generic address people use when they're not sure of a name. My full name, Annalisa Coppola. Said with the precision of someone who had learned it recently and made a point of learning it correctly. I stopped, turned. Ciro Savastano had followed me out of the building. He was standing 3 feet away, and he did not look like a man who was accustomed to following people. "How many languages?" he said. I looked at him. The morning light was different from the conference room light, flatter, less kind, more revealing. The scar along his jaw was more visible, the silver at his temples. The particular stillness he had had from the moment I saw him, as though he had decided long ago that the world would come to him, rather than the other way around. and the world had generally agreed. 7, I said. He nodded once, as though this confirmed something. I'd like you to come in tomorrow, he said. Not to clean. Emma. Not to clean. 2 words. And somehow they hold everything the story is about to become. 3 days after the conference room, I returned to Meridian Capital Group at 9 in the morning, which was, for me, the equivalent of most people's 3 a.m., wearing the navy blazer I had owned for 4 years and carried with me from Geneva to Chicago in a garment bag that was now held together by safety pins at the handle. The blazer still fit. I had made sure of it. The lobby security guard looked at me the way all lobby security guards look at people who don't quite fit the context. I gave him my name. He checked his screen, checked again, and called up. Then he printed a visitor badge and slid it across the counter with the particular neutrality of someone who has decided not to have an opinion. The elevator to 38 was different from the elevator to the cleaning floors. It was quieter. The carpet was real. The lighting was warm instead of fluorescent. And when the doors opened on 38, I stepped into a space that smelled of leather and cold air, and the very faint trace of coffee from somewhere I couldn't identify. Nothing chemical, nothing industrial. A woman at the reception desk looked up. She had the composed expression of someone who manages access for a living and has learned to evaluate people within the first 2 seconds of eye contact. I watched her evaluate me. "Annalisa Coppola," I said before she asked. "Mr. Savastano is expecting you." A pause that I was not supposed to read but that I read anyway. The pause of someone deciding not to say what they're thinking. "His assistant will take you through." The assistant was a young man named, his badge said, Gennaro Napolitano. He had the particular energy of someone who is very competent and knows it without broadcasting it, which I found immediately more trustworthy than the alternative. He walked me down a corridor lined with closed doors and stopped at the last one. "He knows you're here," Gennaro said. And then, unexpectedly, "That was something what you did the other night." I looked at him. "I was outside the room," he said. "I heard it through the door." He said it without flattery, just as a record of fact. Then he knocked on the door and stepped aside. Kiro Savastano was standing at the window. The lake was visible from here. Properly visible, not the glimpsed version I got from the 31st floor corridor. He turned when I came in, and I noticed that he had already removed his jacket. It was folded over the arm of the chair nearest the window. The cufflinks were still on. "Left shoulder removal," I noted, and then noted that I had noted it. The office was large and largely undecorated. A desk with very little on it. A credenza with files. 1 photograph on the wall. Not a landscape. Not an abstract. But a printed document of some kind. Framed. Too far away to read. 2 chairs opposite the desk and 1 behind it. And he was not sitting in any of them. He was standing, as though sitting had not occurred to him as a relevant option. "You came," he said. "You asked." He studied me for a moment with that focused quality of attention that I remembered from the conference room. The attention of someone who does not perform interest, who is either actually interested or actually not, with no middle state. "Tell me about Geneva," he said. I had prepared for many versions of this conversation. Not this one. "That's not in any file you have on me," I said. "No," he said. "It isn't." He said it without apology and without self-congratulation, just as a statement about the limits of his information. Then he waited. I stood in the center of his office in the navy blazer that still fit, with the silver chain at my throat and the thin spiral notebook in my jacket pocket, the one in which I had written, that morning on the bus, 1 word in Arabic and 1 in Japanese, and left the page open, the way I sometimes did when I was nervous and needed the grounding of something I knew. And I considered him. He had followed me out of the building. He had learned my name. He had used the words, "not to clean," with the precision of someone who understood exactly what those words meant to the person he was saying them to. He was standing rather than sitting, which in a power dynamic context was either a dominance cue or a signal of genuine uncertainty, and I had spent enough time in academic seminars to know the difference. He was uncertain, not about me, about what to do with whatever I was. I sat down. The chair was very good, the kind of chair that had been chosen by someone who understood ergonomics rather than aesthetics. I crossed one leg over the other and looked at him. "I was 22, I said. "I had a scholarship in applied linguistics at the University of Geneva. It covered everything: housing, materials, the full program. I was 18 months in when my mother was diagnosed. Early onset Alzheimer's. She was 54. She had no one else. I said it at the pace I always said it, not rushed, not drawn out. The pace of information that has been converted from grief into fact through enough repetitions. So I came home, I said, and then time passed. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you've been at Meridian for 6 years. Yes. Night shift. Yes. Because the day rates are lower and the night differential compensates. I looked at him. He had done the math. He had thought about why someone would choose nights, had identified the economic logic, and had said it plainly rather than leaving me to explain it. I was not sure whether to be grateful for the precision or wary of what precision at this level indicated. Among other reasons, I said. The other reasons, he said, and it was not quite a question. Fewer people, I said. Which means fewer explanations. He considered this. Then he moved away from the window and sat in the chair across from me rather than behind the desk, a choice I noted, filed, did not yet interpret. I want to offer you a position, he said. Consultant, Cultural and Linguistic Analysis for International Partnerships. You'll work with the negotiation teams when they need preparation, and with me when I need a read on a room that none of my people can give me. He paused. It would require a schedule change, days, some travel. I said nothing. I was counting, not seconds this time, but variables. The care arrangements I had in place for my mother's care home, now that she was gone, the routine I had built around nights, the way I had learned to inhabit invisibility as a structure rather than a lack. My mother had died 8 months ago. At the care home, at 60 in the early morning, with a face that had, the nurses told me, been completely peaceful, as though she had gone somewhere she recognized. I had not cried at the memorial. I had cried at the bus stop afterward, alone, in the February cold, because the bus had been late, and the cold had gotten into something I had been keeping closed, and I had let it, for 4 minutes. Then the bus came. There's a condition, I said. He waited. A fund, I said, established as part of the arrangement, for employees in non-executive roles at Meridian who have professional skills that their current position doesn't use. Identification, support, development, structured access to training, educational leave, advancement pathways. I kept my voice level. People who are invisible in buildings like this one because they're cleaning the floors, or running the mail, or managing the parking. Not because they don't have something to offer. Ciro Savastano looked at me for a long time. That's your condition, he said. Yes, he was quiet. Not the quiet of someone deciding, the quiet of someone who has already decided and is taking a moment with the fact of the decision before speaking it. All right, he said. I looked at him. I'll have legal draw up the terms this week, he said. The fund will be structured as a separate entity with its own board. You'll have a seat on it. He said this the way he had said everything, without ceremony, without making it larger than it was, in the flat declarative tone of someone who meant what they said, and didn't need the sentence to carry more weight than the words already had. I uncrossed my legs. I looked at the framed document on the wall, still too far to read. What is that? I asked. He turned to look at it as though he had forgotten it was there. A letter, he said. In Latin, it was my sister's. She was studying classics. She died when she was 9. He said this the way I had said the thing about my mother, at the pace of something that has been converted from wound into fact. I had it framed because I couldn't read it, and I didn't want to have someone translate it, and I couldn't throw it away. I looked at the framed document. Then I looked at him. It's a passage from Cicero, I said. The beginning of it says, "What we cannot speak of, we must carry." He looked at me. That's a reasonable translation, I said. Not the only one, but reasonable. He was quiet for 3 full seconds. The scar along his jaw caught the morning light. Monday, he said. 9 a.m. Monday, I said. Emma. He had a letter in Latin on his wall that he'd never had translated. For years. And she just read it. I don't know why that detail undoes me every single time, but it does. The weeks that followed had a grammar I did not immediately recognize because I had spent 6 years learning a different one. The grammar of night work was simple. Begin at the periphery, move inward. Disturb only what needs to be disturbed. Leave no traces. Clock out. The grammar of Meridian's 38th floor was more complex, not because the work itself was harder, though some of it was, but because it required me to be visible in a way I had systematically unlearned. I was visible in the negotiation preparation sessions because that was the job. I reviewed cultural briefing documents that were frequently wrong in the ways that non-linguists are wrong when they research language, accurately about vocabulary, negligently about register. I corrected them, produced alternatives, Flagged the specific moments in proposed deal structures where the language being used by the Meridian side would land differently than intended on the other side. This was the work I had trained for. I did it well. I did not need praise to know I did it well. But I noticed when it was acknowledged and I noticed when it wasn't. The way you notice temperature, not requiring anything, just registering. The grammar I did not recognize was the grammar of Kiro Savastano's attention. He did not treat me the way the rest of the floor treated me, which was with a careful professional courtesy that contained underneath it a faint uncertainty about category. I was not an executive, not a staff member in the conventional sense, not a consultant from outside, something between and beside and adjacent. The floor had not yet developed a grammar for me, and I understood that. The floor would develop one or it wouldn't, and either outcome was navigable. Ciro treated me the way he treated the problems that interested him, directly, with complete attention, without the mediating layer of social performance that most professional relationships required. He would call me into his office not with the formula, "I need you to look at something," but with the actual sentence. The Milanese group uses a legal phrase in their contracts that our lawyers are treating as boilerplate, and I think it isn't. Can you look at this today? Specific. Grounded. The exact shape of the actual request. I found this easier to navigate than courtesy. Courtesy required reciprocal performance. Direct requests required only direct responses. Tiziana, when I described this to her over coffee in her kitchen on a Thursday morning, I had switched to days, which meant our schedules were inverted. She arriving home as I was leaving, passing each other in the stairwell, tilted her head and said, "He respects you. He respects the skill." I said, "That's the same thing," she said, "for a man like that." I had thought about this. I was still thinking about it. Achille Esposito, whom I had identified early as a man who wore professional warmth the way some people wear a garment that doesn't quite fit, correctly, carefully, but with a slight pulling at the seams, had been precise in his courtesy toward me from the first day. He was 55, and had been Kiro's right hand for 18 years, and he occupied his position with the ease of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove his value and has moved into a different mode. Maintenance. He was always in the room when he should be. He always knew the names of the relevant parties. He always said the right thing at the right volume. He also, I had noticed by the end of my second week, asked questions in a particular way. Not direct questions, angled ones. Questions that seemed to be about the work, but were shaped to collect specific information. Who I had talked to, what I had been asked to review, what I had told Kiro after the Turkish preliminary meetings that had required my presence. The questions were good. They were the questions of someone who understood that the most revealing information is usually available in the seams between official communications, and who had spent years learning how to access those seams without appearing to. I answered what I answered. I noted what I noted. I kept the notation to myself. My notebook had a new page by the end of week 2, 1 word per language, as usual. But beneath the words, in a shorthand I had developed in Geneva for dense lecture environments. Abbreviations that looked like random marks, but that organized information by category, priority, and confidence level. I had begun to write something else. I had been a linguist. A linguist pays attention to what is said, what is not said, and what cannot be said directly, and therefore moves through other channels. The channels through which Achille Esposito communicated were very good, but language always leaves traces, always. Even the most careful speaker leaves traces, because language is not a container for meaning. It is meaning, and meaning cannot be fully controlled. I was beginning to read what he was actually saying. I did not yet know what it meant. I continued to show up at 9, do the work, leave at 6. I rewrote 3 briefing documents, flagged a contractual phrase in the Milan group materials that turned out, when I explained it to Cairo, to shift the liability structure in a way that Meridian's legal team had not noticed. I attended 2 meetings as a cultural observer. I ate lunch at my desk and read, because lunch crowds were loud, and I was not yet recalibrated to the density of daytime humanity. On a Tuesday in my 4th week, Kiro came into the office I had been given, a small one off the corridor, with a window that faced not the lake, but the interior courtyard, which I preferred, and sat in the chair across from my desk without announcement or preamble. "Tell me something," he said. I looked up from the document I was reading. "You've been here 4 weeks," he said. "You've corrected 11 briefing documents, flagged 1 liability issue that saved us approximately $400,000 in restructuring costs, and declined every invitation to the executive lunches. He said this not as a ledger of complaints, but as a ledger of observations, the way someone reads a text they don't yet fully understand. "What are you thinking about that you're not saying?" I held his gaze for a moment. The afternoon light from the courtyard window came in at a low angle and hit the edge of his desk, throwing a line of warmth across the space between us. "Give me another week," I said. He studied me. 3 seconds. I had begun to calibrate his silences. 3 was consideration. 5 was decision. More than 7 was something I had not yet seen. "All right," he said, and left. I looked at the line of light on the desk for a moment. Then I opened my notebook to the shorthand page and added 3 new observations from the morning's briefing meeting. Achille Esposito had asked Gennaro Napolitano, casually, in the corridor after the meeting, what language the Arabic team's lead counsel preferred for informal communications. Gennaro had answered correctly. Achille had nodded and moved on. The lead counsel's language preference was not relevant to Achille's current responsibilities. It was relevant to someone who was planning a back-channel communication that would need to bypass the standard interpretation protocols. It was relevant to someone who already knew, or suspected, that the standard protocols might not be available much longer. I closed the notebook. I pressed my palm flat against the cover for a moment, a habit from study sessions in Geneva, a physical act of containing information before moving. 1 more week. The Mandarin session arrived on a Thursday morning and confirmed what I had been building toward for 2 weeks in terms of the briefing work. The Shenyang group was coming in for preliminary discussions on a northern infrastructure partnership, smaller than the Arabic deal, but structurally more complex, with a web of regional government relationships embedded in the language of the proposal that you could only read correctly if you understood the specific way that northeastern Chinese official communication had evolved over the past 20 years, which required not just Mandarin competence, but a granular sense of regional register and the social weight of specific administrative vocabulary. I had prepared a briefing document. It was 31 pages. It was the best briefing document I had produced in my career in any field. Zero read it before the meeting. I knew this not because he told me, but because when he came into the pre-session room, he asked a question about the 3rd paragraph of page 7, a specific, technically precise question about the difference between 2 terms I had distinguished in a footnote. He had read the footnote. He had thought about it. "The first one is administrative authority," I said. "The second one is relational authority. They're not synonyms. Our team keeps using them as synonyms." "Which one do they actually have?" he asked. "Currently, the second. They want the first. The whole proposal is structured around that gap." He was quiet for a moment. "Then, and if we close it for them, then they stop negotiating and start building." He looked at me with the focused, weightless attention that I had categorized after 3 weeks as his natural resting mode. Not warmth, not coldness, but a quality of complete presence that most people interpreted as intensity, and that I had come to think of as simply the absence of performance. "You should be in the room today," he said. "I was planning to be," I said. "The session ran 4 hours. I spoke when I was needed and did not when I wasn't, which was another thing that I had learned in seminar rooms, and that served in negotiation rooms equally well. The most powerful intervention is often the one that waits until it is actually necessary." The Shenyang group's lead was a woman in her early 60s, with a formal manner that concealed substantial flexibility. I identified this in her syntax within the first 20 minutes, and by the 3rd hour she was addressing her most precise questions directly to me, which I translated both ways with the full weight of their actual meaning. And the room shifted in the way rooms shift, when language stops being an obstacle and becomes a medium. After the session, in the corridor, Gennaro Napolitano fell into step beside me and said quietly, "Achille left the room twice during the 3rd hour." I kept walking. "I thought you might want to know," he said. I glanced at him. He had a careful face, the face of someone who had learned to be useful by being observant, and who had decided at some point that this particular observation was worth sharing. "Thank you," I said. "I don't know what it means," he said. "I might," I said. I went back to my office and opened my notebook. The 5th week began on a Monday with rain, a Chicago February rain, which was not soft or ambient but structural, the kind that came in horizontally from the lake and made the windows of the 38th floor sound like they were being tested. I arrived at 9 with the notebook already open in my bag to the shorthand page, because the previous Friday I had added something that required a response this week, and I had been turning it over all weekend in the way I turned over linguistic problems, not actively, but in the background, the way translation runs underneath other thought like a second current. Achille Esposito had, on Friday afternoon, placed a call from a conference room on the 36th floor. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that he had booked the room under a different name, a name I recognized from the administrative directory as belonging to an analyst who had left Meridian 4 months ago. I knew this not because I had been monitoring him. I knew it because Gennaro had quietly begun routing certain administrative anomalies past my door, in the way that people who work in systems route inconsistencies toward whoever seems most likely to understand them. Gennaro did this without declaring it, without framing it as anything, simply allowing the information to arrive in my vicinity, and then leaving. The call was 40 minutes. The conference room system logged the duration, but not the destination. The system was old enough on those floors that outgoing calls were logged only by time, not number, unless routed through the main exchange. This call was not routed through the main exchange. A 40-minute call, in a room booked under a departed analyst's credentials, on a Friday afternoon when Ciro was in Washington for a preliminary federal partnership meeting. I had written that in shorthand. I had added 2 words beneath it in Japanese, a language I used when I needed a cognitive register that felt cleanest, most stripped of emotional association, and closed the notebook. On Monday morning, I went to Ciro's office before my own. He was already there. He was standing at the window again, which I had come to understand was his default position when he was thinking rather than working, a distinction I had observed mattered to him, though he would likely not have named it that way. He turned when I came in. I put the notebook on his desk, open to the shorthand page. "Can you read this?" I asked. He looked at it. "No, I'll translate," I said. And I did, not the shorthand marks themselves, but what they recorded, item by item, date by date, observation by observation, the angled questions about my access and conversations, the inquiry about the Arabic Council's language preference, the 2 absences during the Shenyang session at moments when key terms were being established, the Friday call, the pattern underneath all of it, which was not a pattern of curiosity or administrative carelessness, but a pattern of preparation, someone building a map of information they intended to use. Ciro listened without interrupting. He had the stillness of someone receiving information they have been half expecting and are now calibrating against the version they had already constructed internally. The scar along his jaw was very visible in the gray rain light from the window. When I finished, he was quiet for 7 seconds. I had never counted 7 before. "How long?" he said. Not, "Are you sure?" or "What do you mean?" or the defensive reframe. Just, "How long?" "I believe it predates me," I said. The Arabic deal was the trigger, not the origin. Someone arranged for the interpreters to fail, all 10 of them. I paused. That's not incompetence. That's a coordinated outcome. 7 seconds had told me what I needed to know about his internal state. The next 3 seconds told me the rest. He had already considered this possibility. He was not shocked. He was grieving, in the specific wordless way that people grieve when a thing they feared is confirmed. 18 years, he said. Not to me. To the rain on the window. I did not say anything. Some things do not require translation. He turned from the window. The grief was gone, not processed, stored. His face had returned to the flat, clean surface of a man who knows how to contain things and move. "What do you need?" he said. I had thought about this. "Access to the call logs from the 36th floor conference rooms for the past 8 months, I said. "The external communication records from the deals where interpretation was required, and the original interpreter contracts from the Arabic negotiation." "You'll have them today." "And one more thing," I said. He waited. "Gennaro Napolitano," I said. "He's been routing things to me quietly. He doesn't know the full picture, but he knows enough to be paying attention. He's loyal to you. I can read that clearly. But he needs to know there's a reason to keep routing." Ciro looked at me for a moment. Something in his expression shifted, barely perceptible, the way a word shifts meaning when you change the register it's spoken in. "Tell him," he said, "what he needs to know." "How much is that?" "Your judgment," he said. And the simplicity of it, the directness of handing me that, landed somewhere in my chest that I had not expected anything to land. I picked up my notebook. I went to my office. Outside, the rain had intensified. The lake was invisible behind it. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop and began, systematically and without hurry, to build the record. Emma. She spent 3 weeks in silence, collecting evidence the way she'd always collected language, carefully, precisely, without announcing what she was doing. This is the thing about people who've learned to be invisible. When they finally choose to be seen, they're ready. The records arrived in my inbox at 2 in the afternoon, access granted by Kiro through a channel I did not need to understand the technical specifics of, the files properly formatted, the call logs going back 9 months. I worked through them the way I worked through a dense text in an unfamiliar dialect, beginning not with the content, but with the structure, identifying the pattern before reading the specific instances. The Arabic interpreter contracts were the clearest confirmation. 7 of the 10 had been engaged through a single intermediary agency, an agency that, when I traced its registration through public business records, had been established 14 months ago and had no other significant clients. The contracts contained a non-standard addendum in the fine print, below the standard non-disclosure provisions, that specified compensation adjustments contingent on performance outcome variances in high-value negotiations. It was written in the deliberate obscurity of legal language designed to be present in the record without being legible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. It meant, get paid more if the deal fails. I photographed each page with my phone. I wrote the date, the document reference, and a 3-word notation in my shorthand in the margin of my notebook. The call logs from the 36th floor conference rooms told the second part of the story, cross-referencing dates, times, and the deal calendar that Gennaro had quietly sent me 2 weeks ago in what he had labeled a scheduling sync. I mapped 17 calls over 8 months. 12 of them were on days when Ciro was traveling. 3 were on days when major deal phases were finalizing. 2, the most recent 2, were on days when I had been in the building. Someone had been tracking the schedule, not Meridian's official schedule, which was distributed to executive staff. A different schedule, more granular, including internal meeting details that were not on the shared calendar. Someone with access to the actual operational calendar. I added this to the record. I did not let myself feel the weight of it. Feeling the weight of it was for later. Right now, the work was the work. At 4:30, Hanato appeared at my office door. He knocked, which he hadn't done before. I looked up. He told me to check in with you, Gennaro said. Come in, I said. Close the door. He sat across from me, and I told him what he needed to know. I did not tell him everything, not yet. But I told him enough, that the interpreter failure had not been accidental, that the evidence was building toward a source, and that his observations over the past weeks had contributed to building it. I watched his face while I spoke. He was a careful listener, which I had already known, but he was also a careful reactor. His expressions moved slowly, as though he processed internally before allowing anything to surface. When I finished, he sat quietly for a moment. The agency, he said. I flagged that agency to Achille 8 months ago. The registration looked strange to me. He told me it was a legacy vendor and not to pull the thread. I looked at him. I thought I was wrong, he said. I let it go. He said it without self-flagellation, just as a fact about a moment in which the available information had pointed in a direction, and he had chosen not to follow it. I won't do that again. No, I said. You won't. I told him what I needed from him going forward. Nothing visible, nothing that would change his behavior in any observable way. Continue as normal. Root anything that felt anomalous. Don't ask Cairo questions about it in spaces where he could be observed. He nodded. He stood to leave, then stopped. He hasn't had anyone give him actual information in a long time, Gennaro said. Everyone tells him what he wants to hear, or what they think won't cost them. You don't do that. I said nothing. I just thought you should know, he said, that it means something to him. What you do. He left. I looked at my notebook. I wrote 1 word in it, in Swahili, a language I had studied for 6 months in Geneva as an elective because the tonal structure interested me, and it was the Swahili word for trust, which also, in certain registers, carries the weight of the word for wait. The confrontation came on a Thursday, and it came because I made it come. I had the full record by then, call logs, contracts, the cross-referenced calendar analysis, a financial trail that Gennaro had helped me trace through the intermediary agency back to a holding entity whose registered address was a property owned by a trust linked to Achille Esposito's family. I had it documented in 6 copies, stored in 6 different locations, with 1 copy sent to Gennaro with instructions that were sealed and only to be opened under specific conditions. I had prepared it the way I had prepared my thesis in Geneva, with the rigor of someone who understands that the work must be able to stand independently of the person who produced it. I asked Kiro for an hour on Thursday afternoon. He cleared his schedule. I laid the record out on his desk, physical copies in order, with a 1-page summary that I had written in plain English. No jargon, no hedging. I walked him through it. He read what I pointed to, listened when I explained. asked 3 questions, specific, precise, pointing to the moments in the record where the evidence was strongest. When I finished, he sat back. "The recordings," he said. "Yes," I said. "That's the final piece. The call logs documented that calls were made. They documented duration and timing. They did not document content. To close the record completely, to make it undeniable, to foreclose the possibility of deniability that a skilled lawyer could construct around the paper trail alone, we needed the content of at least one of the calls. The conference room system on 36, I said. The call logging system is old, but the room recording system, the one installed for legal compliance in 2019, is not the same system. It doesn't log by extension. It records by room occupancy. I paused. Every meeting in those rooms has been recorded for 4 years. Ciro was very still. The recordings are archived on a server, I said. Your IT director will know how to access them. Gennaro can liaise. You already know what's in them, he said. I know what I expect to find, I said. I haven't accessed them. That's yours to do. He looked at me across the desk, across the neat stack of evidence I had built over 4 weeks from a shorthand notation in a water-stained spiral notebook, and his face had the quality it sometimes had when he was near something that moved him, absolutely still on the surface, with something underneath it that I had learned to read not as emotion, but as the space where emotion had been. Why did you do this? He said. The question landed differently than it might have. Not, why are you helping me? Which would have been a transactional question, one I could have answered transactionally, but why did you do this? With the weight of all 4 weeks behind it. The weight of someone who was trying to understand the motivation of a person who had no obligation, no leverage, no history with him. Because it was true, I said, and I translate true things. He held my gaze for a moment, longer than his usual calibrated silences. The fund, he said. I want you to name it. I had not expected that. I sat with it. After my mother, I said. The Instituto Rachele. He nodded. The nod of a man for whom certain things are settled. Then that's what it will be, he said. Emma, I translate true things. I have written a lot of stories, and I think that line is one of the most honest things a character has ever said to me while I was writing them. The Thursday afternoon meeting to present the evidence, not to Kiro, this time, but to the full senior leadership, had been Kiro's design, and I understood why he had designed it the way he had. He had not announced an agenda. He had called an ordinary quarterly review, the kind that the senior team attended as a matter of routine, the kind that Achille Esposito attended with the ease of someone for whom routine is the field in which he is most comfortable. I arrived before the meeting began, and stood at the far end of the room near the projection screen, which was blank. My laptop was connected. The files were open. Achille came in second to last. He saw me at the end of the room, and his face did the thing that faces do when they encounter an unexpected variable, a very brief arrest, barely a quarter second, visible only if you were watching for it and knew what you were looking at. I was watching. I knew. He sat down. He arranged his materials. He crossed one leg over the other and addressed something to the person beside him, with the ease of a man who has been in this room many times and expects to be in it many more. Kiro came in last, closed the door and said, Thank you all for being here. We have one agenda item. I pressed the first key. The screen behind me lit up with the summary page, clean, plain English, the evidence laid out in sequence. I had written it in English. I spoke it in 7 languages, not simultaneously, sequentially, with purpose, each language chosen for what it carried that the others did not. English for the architecture of the facts, because English in legal context is a language of specificity. Italian for the weight of betrayal, because Italian has a grammar for what is owed between people who have chosen each other. Arabic for the interpreter contracts, reading the key phrase aloud in the original so that the room could hear what it meant in the language in which it was intended to mean it. Mandarin for the call log cross-reference, because Mandarin has a register for systematic deception that makes the structure of it audible. German for the financial documentation, because German legal language is the most precise in the world, for describing the movement of assets through concealed structures. French for the recording transcript, because French has a philosophical register that strips a sentence down to what it cannot deny. And Japanese for the final line, the line that simply stated, in the flattest possible construction, what had been done and by whom. I did not look at Achille while I spoke. I looked at the room, which was where the work was. When I finished, the room was silent. Achilles said, in a very controlled voice, "This is fabricated." I looked at him for the first time. "Which part?" I said. He said nothing. "The agency registration?" I said. "The contract addendum, the call logs, the room recordings." I kept my voice even, the way I kept my voice even when I was translating. Because when you are translating, your voice is not yours. It is the medium. "Tell me which part is fabricated, and I will show you the documentation." The room was very quiet. Achille Esposito looked at me, and in his look, I read, the way I had been reading looks and silences, and the gaps between words for 6 weeks, a specific recognition that he had miscalculated, not by much. He had missed one variable, and the variable was standing at the end of the room in a navy blazer, and he had missed it because he had been trained, over 55 years of inhabiting systems where power announced itself visibly, to look for the visible. He stood up. He looked at Kiro. Cairo was at the far end of the table. He had not spoken since the meeting began. He said nothing now. He looked at Achille with the expression of a man who has had 18 years to learn a face, and has just finished reading it completely for the first time. Achille walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a click that was very ordinary and very final. Cairo turned to the room. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour," he said. "I'll need the legal team and the board chair." He looked around the table, not at me. "Not yet. Thank you for your time." People began to leave. I started shutting down my laptop. Gennaro came to stand beside me. He said nothing. He just stood there, which was, I had learned, his version of saying a great deal. "Go," I told him. "Ciro will need you." He went. I finished closing the files. I put the laptop in my bag. I took the small spiral notebook from my jacket pocket, the water-stained one, the one with the shorthand page, and I turned to a blank page. I wrote 1 word in it, in every language I knew. 7 lines, 7 words, all the same word. Done. The Istituto Rachele was incorporated 4 months after Achille Esposito's departure from Meridian Capital Group, a departure managed through legal channels, with a settlement that was not publicly discussed, and that I had no involvement in, because it was not my work to do. My work was the fund. It took those 4 months, because building a structure that would outlast the moment that created it requires patience that is different from the patience of waiting. It is the patience of construction, of understanding that the thing you are building is only as good as the foundation, and the foundation requires time and precision. I drafted the charter with a lawyer Gennaro recommended, a woman named Michelina Capri, who had the particular gift of translating complex intentions into legal architecture without losing the intention. And I consulted Tiziana, who had the gift of seeing when a system was designed for the people it claimed to serve, and when it was designed for the people who created it. Tiziana, during this period, had also begun spending considerable time with Gennaro Napolitano, which had developed with the organic momentum of 2 people who are both in the habit of noticing things, and have found someone else who notices things in a complementary register. She called me one evening from what I could tell, by the background sound, was a restaurant, and said, "He asked me what I would have done at 22, if I'd had your choice." "What did you say?" I asked. "I said I didn't know," she said. "But I said I thought what you did was braver than going to Geneva." "It wasn't braver," I said. "It was simpler. Sometimes simplicity is the brave part," she said, and then the background sound shifted, and I could hear Gennaro's voice saying something I couldn't make out. And Tiziana laughed, a real laugh, the unperformed kind, and I smiled at my kitchen wall for a moment before we said goodbye. Ciro came to the Istituto Rachele's inaugural review meeting, not the ceremony, which was scheduled for the following month, but the internal review, which was working and procedural, and attended by the fund's board, the legal team, and the 12 first cohort participants. He sat in the back, which surprised me. He had not told me he was coming. He listened to the 12 participants introduce themselves and describe what they had submitted applications for: a nursing degree, a software certification, a culinary program, an architecture licensing exam, a business management qualification, and others. And he did not speak during the session, and at the end of it, when the participants had left and the board was packing up, he came to stand beside me. 12, he said. First cohort, I said. 37 applicants. We're still developing the selection framework. He nodded. He was looking at the room, the ordinary conference room that had been borrowed for the day, the folding chairs, the whiteboard with the Instituto Rachel name written on it in regular marker by someone who had been in a hurry and whose handwriting was, I noted, better than they probably thought. My sister wanted to study medicine, he said. This was the most he had said about her in the months I had known him. He said it in the flat, factual way of something that has been carried so long it has lost the sharp edges, but not the weight. I know, I said. He looked at me. The Cicero passage, I said. The full translation. It's about what we owe the people we couldn't save. I paused. She would have been 49 this year. He was quiet for a moment. The quality of his stillness had changed over the months I had known him, or perhaps my ability to read it had changed. Either way, I could distinguish now between the stillness of containment and the stillness of presence. This was presence. You should have been in Geneva, he said. I should have been in Geneva, I agreed. And I wasn't, and this is what came from that. I looked at the whiteboard. I don't think those things cancel each other out. I think they're both true at the same time. He turned to look at me. The full, direct attention. The one I had first registered in a conference room in a cleaning uniform. Annalisa, he said, and my name in his voice had a weight that it hadn't had when he'd first said it on a cold morning outside the building. More specific now. More earned. Carrying the accumulated context of everything that had happened between those two moments. I looked at him. I'd like to take you to dinner, he said. Not as a professional courtesy. I considered this. I considered the months of working beside him, the particular quality of his attention, the way he asked direct questions and received direct answers, the way he had not tried to make me smaller than I was, or larger than I was, or anything other than exactly what I was. I considered the Cicero letter on his wall, the cufflinks with the E, the way he stood at windows when he was thinking. I considered the word trust in Swahili, and what it also meant. All right, I said. He almost smiled. The dimple on the right cheek. I had seen it twice in the months I had known him, and it remained the most startling thing about him. Friday, he said. Friday, I said. Emma. I love that she just said, all right. No breathless hesitation, no internal spiral. Just, all right. That's who she is. She decided, and she said it. The ceremony for the Instituto Rachel was held on a Saturday in March, in a conference hall on the 3rd floor of a civic center on the south side. Tiziana had found the space, knowing, without my having to explain it, that it needed to be on this side of the city and not in a glass tower downtown. 214 people attended. The 12 first cohort participants sat in the front row. The board sat behind them. Gennaro was there, beside Tiziana. Ciro was in the last row. He had not told me he was coming to this one either. The program was simple. 3 board members spoke. A first cohort participant, the nursing degree applicant, a woman named Wanda Vesuvio, who had been a hospital orderly for 9 years and who had, I had discovered when reviewing her application, passed the nursing entrance exam 3 years ago, and never had the funding or the scheduling flexibility to act on it, spoke for 4 minutes in a voice that was completely steady, and said things I will not summarize because they were hers and they deserved to be heard whole. Then I spoke. I had written the speech in English and translated it, in the weeks before the ceremony, into the other 6 languages. I had not written it to be translated. I had written it as itself, in each language, which is different from translation. Each version was its own thing, shaped by what the language could carry. I spoke for 11 minutes. I spoke about my mother, Rochelle, who had come from a town outside Naples with $400 and 3 words of English, and had built a language from the inside out. I spoke about Geneva, without sentimentality, as a fact about a road not taken, and what grew in the place of it. I spoke about 6 years on the night shift in a building that did not know my name, and what you see from that angle, and what is lost when we cannot see it. And then I said, in each of the 7 languages, in turn, Italian first for her, because it was hers, the sentence I had been carrying since the morning of the memorial, when the bus had been late, and the cold had gotten into something I had been keeping closed. My mother never knew what I became, but I became it because of her. 7 times. 7 languages. 7 shapes of the same truth. The hall was quiet at the end. Ciro Savastano, in the last row, stood up. He stood alone, for a moment, in the silence, and then the room followed him. and the applause was the kind that happens when something true has been said in a space large enough to hold it. I stood at the lectern and I did not try to stop what came into my face, because some things are not for containing. The Instituto Rachele enrolled its second cohort 6 months later, 41 participants. The third cohort, a year after that, 67. By the end of the second year, it had expanded to include partnerships with 4 universities, 2 professional licensing bodies, and a mentorship network built from first cohort graduates who had completed their programs and had, each of them, agreed to return. Not because it was required, because they wanted to. Wanda Vesuvio was a registered nurse. She worked days. She sent me a photograph from her first shift in her scrubs and wrote beneath it, in a text, simply, "Grazie." I kept the photograph. Tiziana and Gennaro were engaged by the time the second cohort began. They told me at a dinner in Tiziana's kitchen, the same kitchen where we had spent so many early mornings, her coming off her shift, me going to mine, with the ease of people who have arrived somewhere. They were always going and are simply noting the arrival. I hugged them both and opened the wine, and we talked until 2 in the morning, the way we used to when our schedules overlapped in the dark. Cairo and I had dinner the Friday after the ceremony, and the Friday after that, and the Friday after that. The grammar of it developed the way grammars develop, not by design, but by accumulation, one element building on the last, until the structure is there and you look back and cannot identify the moment it became a structure, rather than a collection of moments. He told me about Elena, not all at once, in the way that people tell the things they've carried longest, in installments, as trust accumulates. She had been 9, he had been 16. He had been the one who was supposed to walk her home from school. He had been 20 minutes late, for a reason he could not now fully reconstruct, and she had crossed the street alone, and a car had come from the direction she hadn't checked. He had carried this, not as a fact, but as a weight that had shaped everything he built afterward, the way a building is shaped by the weight it is designed to bear. I listened. I did not tell him it wasn't his fault, because that was not what he needed from me. I told him that she would have been 49, and that she had studied Cicero, and that the Cicero passage she had chosen was one that said, in Latin, that what we cannot speak of we must carry, but that the full passage continued, and the continuation said that what we carry long enough becomes part of our structure, and our structure is what we build with. He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I think I've been building the wrong things." "What would the right things be?" I asked. He looked at me across a restaurant table, a small place in a neighborhood I had suggested, because I had eaten there on lunch breaks when I first moved to Chicago, before the shift to nights, and the pasta was the closest thing I had found to what Rachele used to make on Sundays. He looked at me with the fixed, weightless attention that I had first registered in a conference room when I was holding a cleaning cloth and speaking Arabic. "This," he said, "things like this." I reached across the table and turned his cufflink over, the one with the E, so that the engraving faced up. He let me. He watched me do it. "She'd have liked you," he said. "She'd have read Cicero to me," I said. He did smile then, the full one, the dimple, rare as a correct translation of something that was never meant to be translated. I smiled back. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does in March, trying to decide whether it was still winter, the sky going back and forth between gray and a tentative blue that felt like a question. Inside, the pasta was the right temperature, and the bread was good, and the notebook in my pocket had a blank page waiting. I had not yet decided what word to write in it. I thought I might leave it blank for a while, something I had never done. A pause in the record, a space that was not empty but held. We walked out into the March evening, and the wind off the lake was cold but not hostile, and Kiro put his hand at the small of my back, lightly, a question, and I let it stay there, and we walked, and the city went on around us the way cities do, without noticing, without requiring, without knowing our names, which was, I had decided long ago, exactly how I preferred it. I think about what we hide, not from others, we all know how to hide from others, but from ourselves. Annalisa spent 6 years mopping floors in a building that held one of the most powerful financial organizations in Chicago, and every night she translated her life into something bearable by writing one word in 7 languages in a water-stained notebook. She wasn't hiding. She was protecting something she wasn't ready to use yet. I think there's a difference, even if it's hard to see from the outside. What moved me about this story as I wrote it was not the moment she stepped into the conference room. It was the moment she picked her cart back up afterward and kept cleaning. That was the character. Everything else followed from that. I hope this story gave you something to carry. Not a burden, but one of those things you find yourself thinking about in quiet moments. The kind that asks you, gently, what you might be protecting that you're ready to use. Thank you for spending this time with me. It genuinely means everything. And now, click on the video appearing now on your screen, because there is another story waiting for you, and I promise it is worth your time.